Hello, my name is Jason,
And I'm Connor.
and this is the Amazed and Perplexed podcast.
Today's passage is found in John chapter 5, starting in verse 16. It says this: "So because Jesus was doing these things on the Sabbath, the Jewish leaders began to persecute him. In his defense, Jesus said to them, 'My Father is always at work to this very day, and I too am working.' For this reason, they tried all the more to kill him. Not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. Jesus gave them this answer: 'Very truly, I tell you, the Son can do nothing by himself. He can only do what he sees his Father doing, because whatever the Father does, the Son also does. For the Father loves the Son and shows him all he does. Yes, and he will show him even greater works than these, so that you will be amazed. For just as the Father raises the dead and gives them life, even so the Son gives life to whom he is pleased to give it. Moreover, the Father judges no one, but has entrusted all judgment to the Son, that all may honor the Son just as they honor the Father. Whoever does not honor the Son does not honor the Father who sent him.'" Jason, what amazes you?
What amazes me about this text is I was taught that Jesus was the star of the show. And Jesus is saying, God's the star of the show. I just do what he tells me to do. I don't do anything unless he tells me to do that. And I just think that that is an amazing, humble thing to say. And it amazes me of the implications in my life of what's the expectation of me. In other words, he's saying, I don't have my own script that I write and then go back and say, how was that God? He's saying, God is constantly writing the script, and I am saying it as he gives it to me. And that just amazes me because it reframes how I think about Jesus walking the earth.
Yeah, no, it's an incredibly helpful perspective. And the question that pops to my mind is, if that's true about Jesus, right? If that's the lens that he's viewing his walk here on earth, and how does that affect us? And, affect us as terms of leaders or terms of, members of a church. Man, what does that mean for us if Jesus is saying he isn't the star of the show? Then how much less the star of the show are we?
That's exactly right. And that the waves, if you think about, drop the stone in the water and the ripple effect of my life expectations. I've been working with this concept for only a couple years, and it's already had so much impact on my life. And I think those ripples will continue. But it really is, this passage in many ways defies how I was raised to be a Christian, to be a Christ follower. Yeah. What about you? What amazes you about this?
What amazes me about this passage is this is a direct connection to the very beginning of creation. So you go back to creation, right? You go back to the creation of Adam and Eve, and God entrusts dominion. He entrusts judgment and dominion to Adam and Eve over the animals, over the care of the earth. And one of the things that we see in Jesus is he is the true Adam. He is the true fulfillment of that calling. And this is an example of that. In the later verses of this passage, Jesus will talk about how the Father has entrusted all judgment to the Son, how he's entrusted all of this care and all of this dominion to the Son. And what's so amazing to me about this passage is Adam, and by further extension, we couldn't do that, right? We couldn't possess this dominion, this judgment over all the earth. We are not capable of it, and we can't do it, but yet Jesus is. And so, man, it's just incredible when I have that perspective, that God is not just wiping away because we couldn't get the job accomplished. God is not just wiping us away and saying, well, fine, I'll do it myself. He is grafting us into the process. He is making us a part of his ongoing work. And man, I think that is just so incredible, because for me, I'm the kind of person that, you know, when I was in school and I had a group project and I had a guy in my group who didn't do anything, you know, I just want to say, well, get lost and I'll do everything, and you can put your name on the project, and I'll hold a grudge against you until I'm at least 24. Probably I'll hold it for much longer. But what I love about God is he is not just abandoning that plan. And that's just amazing to me. He's not abandoning humanity, and he's not abandoning his original intent.
Yeah, and we didn't touch on verse 24, but the whole section obviously has power, but he really says, he really reinforces what you just said, that idea that if you hear and believe, and that believe is a constant, not just one time, but you're constantly saying, okay, I'm choosing to believe you, you've crossed over to death, to where he is, and in the same space as he is. And I think that is man, we could go all day on that, but that the implications are really beautiful. And I think if you are listening to this and you're like, man, I don't feel life, I don't feel vibrancy, I don't feel joy, I think there's a correlation to this, that you haven't moved into that space. I don't feel purposeful. Like what Connor just described, that was purposefulness. Like we are joining him in this. Like he's not just wiping it away, and he's not just saying, I'll do it. He's saying, I'll do it, and I want to include you in this beautiful thing. But it ties into what Jesus says in 24. You have to choose to believe, not just believe there is a God, but believe there's a God. Well, this is Hebrews 11:6, and he rewards those who seek him, that there's power in you participating, both kingdom power, implications for the kingdom, but also power in you and your sense of self and your sense of purpose and your sense of, you know, all these dynamics that God wants to bring.
Yeah, I mean, it's so life-giving. Did you ever have a situation when you were younger, Jason, that you were like maybe a kid or younger teenager, and the older teenagers invited you to be a part of something? They saw value in you. They saw value in what you brought to the table. And even if you're going to play like a lesser part, or even if you weren't going to be the main focal point, like being a part of that big group was like so impactful. I remember for me, I had a situation where I was in 6th grade. It was the first year I was ever at church camp, and I was really great at catching dodgeballs in dodgeball. And so I remember it was a camp where we played dodgeball 24/7, and an older group of teenagers at the camp asked me to be a part of their team because like I was like the designated catcher. I couldn't throw as hard because I hadn't gone through puberty yet, but I could really catch. And I remember that feeling still inside of me, like I get to be a part of what they're doing. I get to be a part of this team. I get to be a part of this process. And man, that feeling, if you can capture how you felt, if you've ever had that feeling, if you can capture how that felt, you can kind of equate, man, that's what God is doing, but it's not just simply with a group project or with a game of dodgeball. It's with his grand plan for history and for creation and for all of this.
That is, I love that. I love that so much. And we could camp right here on this. And I think this would kind of, it ties into what perplexes me. But let me add a sports story of my own. We used to play wiffle ball all the time in my neighborhood. And this is, I've entitled this the Georgie Sams effect. Okay. Georgie Sams was an older brother to my friend, Jason Sams. And Georgie, every once in a while, he's 3 to 4 years older than us, but to me, he was the teenager. You know, I was still in maybe early middle school. And every once in a while, Georgie Sams would jump into our wiffle ball game. It was the same game, same basis, same ball, same rules. It changed the whole game. I remember the Georgie Sams games because it just legitimized everything I was doing. Mm-hmm. And I think the added effect there of capturing the feeling of that I'm being chosen to play this sport. But even to say, you know, and you can make the same basic dynamic because you had played volleyball without being on this team, or not volleyball, but dodgeball without being on this team. And to be able to say, I am living life and I don't feel joy. And yet Jesus says in John 10, he says, I'm going to call you into life that is fully abundant, like just excessively full of life. And if I'm not experiencing that, I have to ask myself, am I totally misperceiving what is happening here? Mm. And that leads to what perplexes me, if I may throw that in, is how we have made Jesus's identity and how to be like Jesus is to be sin-free. That's always Jesus, you know, had all these things, but he never sinned, which is true. I want to be very clear. If Jesus did have sin, then his sacrifice wouldn't mean what it meant, his sacrifice on the cross. It's fascinating to me that Jesus never makes the appeal, do you notice I'm sin-free here? Of course I can speak because I'm sin-free. He never says that. He never talks about himself being sin-free as an appeal to follow him. So his mark, what we want to replicate is not his sin-freeness. Now, what I'm not saying is we need to sin that grace may abound. You know, my answer would be the same as Paul says in Romans 6. He's like, no, by no means. But the dynamic here that he calls us to, again and again, including this passage, is, do you understand what is special about me is I am fully dependent on God. I am the first human to walk this earth that is fully dependent on God. Nothing I say is said without him giving it to me. Nothing I do. It's his dependence that we can replicate. We always think, well, I want to be like Jesus, but I can't do miracles. Well, I want to be like Jesus, but I can't be sin-free. I just haven't ever got there, you know, or even if I started, I have all the sin in the past. And Jesus never calls us to replicate that. He calls us to replicate him depending on God. Now, people say, well, wait a minute. Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, be holy like God. And the thing is, the whole thrust of the Sermon on the Mount is a realization you need a Savior. That's the whole thrust of the Sermon on the Mount. So we've kind of taken that out of context and merged it. Jesus' appeal is, will you depend on God like I depend on God? And we've totally got it wrong. We have to reproduce God in order to be a Christian. We have to be perfect like God is, or at least present that facade. And it robs us of the very life. And that's what perplexes me is really, it's not the text itself as much as the interpretation that we have put on it.
So there's an interesting thing at play here with what you just said, Jason. For me in my own life, I think they're basically two schools of thought, right? We come up with a whole bunch of systems for how we address different issues and how we think about different things. And then there's the other way of doing things, this other system of leaning on God, trusting that he will give you the wisdom and the strength in any individual particular moment, whatever the need may arise. So resting in his power rather than my own power in this other way of doing things. And there's a weird thing that in my mind, and maybe it's in your mind, maybe it's in listeners' minds, I don't know, maybe I'm crazy, that at the same time, the trusting in God, trusting in his way and in his strength seems like the easier way because I don't have to construct all these other methodologies. It seems like it's one or two things. It's very simple. But in a real sense, it's also a lot harder to do than drifting into just coming up with different categories to do things. And so my question is, one, do you feel that? And if you do, how do you address that in your own heart, if that makes sense?
Yeah, so a tremendous question. And so when Jesus says this here about, I don't have this pre-plan. Like I don't have, okay, tomorrow we're going to Samaria, and then I'll meet this woman, and I'll do X, Y, Z. I only do what God tells me to do. And we don't even know how did God tell you this a day ago, a week ago, within the moment? We don't know. But the key here is his responsibility was to trust God, not to figure out what he was going to say the next time. Okay. And I think we see that in Acts too, with these non-Jesus people. They're Jesus people, you understand? People that aren't Jesus walking with God's Spirit. We've lost that and we've traded it, and here's the operative word, for dependence on systems. Systems aren't sinful. Dependence on systems are sinful. Dependence on methodologies, dependence on my church is sinful. And that's the trade-off here, is Jesus isn't dependent on his ability to say smart things. I better say a wise thing here. People will be reading this for years to come. I better come across good here. He was dependent on God, and he said wise things. He was dependent on God, and he did not sin as a result. The reason I, though, want to move to systems is I'm a human. I want things measurable, predictable, controllable. And as soon as you say I'm going to trust God, what that means is I am actually submitting my power. I'm not getting rid of it. I'm offering my power to God for him to use for his purposes in ways that I will not feel comfortable with almost every time. Jesus could have easily walked across the water and not shown himself to the apostles. But he said, I'm going to take you, Peter, and all the other apostles vicariously through the process of having to make a choice. Will I believe you're Jesus, number one, and you're walking on the water, which nobody can. Like, keep in mind in that context, they're more ready to believe a ghost is there than Jesus is. And then second, will you be willing to step out on the water and trust me? This is our everyday life. Everyday life we should be, this is a step out on water day. We need to do that passage sometime.
Yeah.
But because the dynamics are the same, will you trust Jesus more than you trust your system? Because the right system approach to walking on water is don't ever do it, especially in a storm. And so let me give a specific. First of all, does that click? Does that answer your question?
Yes, that does click in my mind.
Okay, so let me give you an example. So I'm walking into a situation 2 weeks ago, but I need you to know this has happened to me for years and years. I'm walking into a situation, just a horrific death has happened, okay? And I'm walking in and I'm talking to the parents of this man that has died, and I'm like, okay, what am I going to say? You know, and I just start putting it together. I'm like, okay, if they ask this, ask that. And then I realize really quickly, I don't know what I'm going to say. I don't know what I'm going to say because I don't know what they need. I don't know what they're going to ask. As soon as I go in and say to myself, yeah, here's what they're going to ask, here's what they're going to need, I start to not listen to them. And I start to listen for the cues for my responses. Now, what happens is God brings to mind things I have said before, things I have studied before, things I have prepared before. So it's not like you have to forget everything you've ever learned. On the contrary, all of that is accessible to God. The key is, am I dependent on my experience? Like I've talked to hundreds, not hundreds, but probably 100 people-ish of who are experiencing grieving. You know what I mean? And so I could easily say, well, here's the top 10 things I say, so I'm just listening for the opportunity to plug those things in. The problem is that may even work in a conversation too, but eventually I will be answering questions they're not asking because I stop listening.
That's good.
Because I assume I know. And the way to not stop listening is you keep listening to God first, then you're able to listen to the person in front of you.
That's good. I love what you said a little bit ago about listening. Am I listening for my cues or am I listening for God and this person in front of me? Man, that is so good. To talk to like the core of what you're saying, trusting and following the path of God, I think is both. It is what we were made to do, right? It's how God formed us to follow after it. It's the most natural path for us, and in some ways, it's the easiest path because that's what we're supposed to be doing. That's what we were created for. But in reality, it's also the hardest because it means not relying on your own understanding and not relying on your own strength. And I think this is the heart of Amazed and Perplexed, right? Is, man, so much of the time, like trusting in God, it can be the most natural, it makes complete sense and it's easy. And then there are times where it seems ludicrous. It seems unsafe. It seems, people will make fun of you for it. And I think that dynamic that we're talking about, I think this is why we do Amazed and Perplexed. I think that this is the heart of why we do this. And so I just love that. So kind of shifting gears into what perplexes me. So this passage starts off, and it says that Jesus is doing things on the Sabbath. And so the Jewish leaders began to persecute him for this. It will go on to say that they recognize what Jesus is saying, that he's equating himself with God. He's calling himself equal to God, which would be blasphemy in their minds. And for most people, it would be blasphemy. What's really perplexing for me is in this moment, right? The Pharisees, they have the ability, the knowledge to interpret Jesus correctly and what he's saying, because Jesus is equating himself with God. He is saying this is true about me, but they don't have the ability to interpret him correctly when he talks about the Sabbath, about what the true purpose of the Sabbath is, what he has actually come to do. And so, man, it's perplexing to me because I know it's true in my own life, but so many times I just look at people and they get halfway there, right? And they can't see the forest through the trees. And it's perplexing to me, and it's encouraging. And it's also kind of disheartening that these people who knew so much about the Bible and so much about the scriptures know more than I could ever possibly know, honestly. Maybe if I studied like they did, but I don't have the stick-to-itiveness to do that. But these people, these learned men who respected, they could see this true fact of what Jesus was saying about himself, but yet they couldn't see the full picture. And man, what that says about us as religious leaders, or what that says about humanity as a whole, it's just perplexing to me.
It is absolutely my life. I will stress. Let's not be. Hey guys, let's give grace. Let's not be judgmental. Let's listen. And when I'm in a vein that makes sense to me, I'm really good, and I'm just trusting God to carry me and watching for it. And then you bring up another subject, and I'm like, well, that's just wrong. I'm not even going to listen.
Yeah.
You know, and which is one of the reasons why I won't allow myself on social media to go off, because I just don't trust myself. Because I'll just get. I just will not participate in heated discussions in those forums, because I will eventually become what I hate. Mm-hmm. I will eventually say I'm halfway there, or a tenth of the way there, or whatever. But I will immediately, when you switch gears on me, I do this all the time with my family, where I'll be like, man, I want to love people. That's the guiding thing. What's the most loving thing? And then I'll come home and I'll feel entitled on one way. Matter of fact, I may serve and put away all the dishes and make dinner and, clean up things and everything. And I'll feel really selfless, and I'm like, man, that was really the most loving thing. And then Heather will ask me to do something I don't want to do, and it's like, I'm entitled.
Yeah.
And so I'm such a hypocrite in that way.
Oh yeah.
But you're so right I think it's good even to credit that just struck me as new when you said, do you see, like in my mind, do you see, Jason, that the Pharisees got some things right? They're not just the bad guys. They're not just wearing the black hats, as it were. They are getting some things right. They just refuse to be humble in the areas where they're not getting it right.
So I think this is the truth about the Pharisees that is, I think, has been really revolutionary in my life. It's like you said, that, like we talked about in our questions and reflections episode about the woman caught in adultery. I don't think necessarily the Pharisees are the bad guys. I think maturity for me when I read scripture is recognizing that if I had been placed in the position of the Pharisees, if I had grown up like the Pharisees, there's a good chance I would have been a Pharisee. I would have been like them. It's the same thing when we look back, in terms of psychologically, and we look back, if we had grown up in Nazi Germany, who would we have been? For me, if I'm dropped back there now, there's a good chance that I would fight, and I would fight oppression. But if I had grown up like them, or I had grown up in their situations, there's a chance I would have committed horrible atrocities. And there's a recognition in me that I'm capable of evil, that I'm capable of these things. And for me, maturity in regards to the Pharisees is recognizing not only do I do the things that they do and talk about the same things they talk about all the time, I could have literally been exactly them, placed in their situation.
Yeah, I'm trying to draw to mind the man that, I know this guy's name, and I'm just not drawing it right now, but he was in a concentration camp, and he survived, and he went to Nuremberg, the trials, and everything. And when the guy walked in, it was the highest ranking person that lived, that was brought to trial. He was really shook. And it wasn't because of all the evil. It's the idea the guy looked just like him.
Yeah.
He looked normal. And in his mind, he had to look evil and just exude, just pure awfulness. And I think that humility is something, this is why we're called to humility in so many different ways, so many different times throughout the New Testament, is just that realization that there truly is, when we go to correct somebody, our first thing is, this in Matthew 7, is we need to recognize we are just as guilty, we are just as bad, and pick another aspect of life, and they would be the ones coming to us. Mm-hmm. We have to own that first, embrace humility, and then ask God, what's the most loving way? That's why when he says we remove the speck from the eye, you're not jabbing the eye. When you remove a speck from another human's eye, you're being really super overly careful, and that's a loving way to do that. And so if we would just...
You're being surgical.
Exactly. I mean, and very precision, and you're listening for them. I mean, how cruel would it be if you're poking people down and they're saying, ow, 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 and you're just ignoring them? You know what I mean? And that's certainly not the picture there in the text, that there's a gentleness that's built in, to the concept.
Yeah, absolutely. I even wonder, if podcasting technology would have been around 2,000 years ago, I would bet some podcasts by some Pharisees I bet it'd be utterly fascinating. I bet it'd be like incredibly interesting. And we would gain a lot from it. And so I think this sort of dialogue, the challenging, the questioning, this is what the Pharisees did. This is what the religious leaders would have done in the Jewish religion at that time. And I think it's an important reminder, even for this exercise for us, even as we talk about humility and approaching it like this, it's very easy for us. It'd be very easy for us to slide over into militant humility. I don't know. Would that be a bad thing if we couldn't see if we didn't see humility in something, or we didn't see a particular aspect of humility, like a particular fruit of humility, if we didn't see that outwardly in something, could we possibly miss a picture of something?
I think this goes back to the root of this text is, once Jesus says, I am not speaking from my experience. Mm-hmm. I'm not speaking from my personality, my preferences. I only speak what God tells me to speak. That level of humility, that level of teachability, constant just teaching, learning. That is the model. That's what disciple means, a learner. And I think that these are all tied in, and the fact that we've separated those and we've made humility a factor that you do as a Christian versus that's who you are.
That's good.
It's not just a practice. Oh, I need to apply humility here. No, I am humble because I don't deserve to be at the table, and God freely not just welcomes me, but keeps me there and nourishes me there and provides what I need there. And I think this, if that were more baked in to, this is what it means when I wake up in the morning and say, I'm a disciple. I'm with you, God. You've got this. Then immediately I'm humbled because his ways aren't my ways. I'll never master the material, and that's not even on the table. The issue is, will I trust him? And see, this goes back to something you said previously. At face value, you're like, trusting him is easy. You know what I mean? Having 1,000 strategies for every situation, that would be so hard. The reason, though, we tend to lean towards the 1,000 strategies is because I'll say it this way, we hate looking foolish. I would even say, and this is a bold thing, many of us would rather say, I will never share Jesus with you, rather than feel foolish. And it's because, and he says in 1 Corinthians, that chapter 1, he says, look, this is foolishness, to the people. This idea of I serve a guy that died and was raised, that's just foolishness to the minds of our common culture. And that's what I'm saying. It's foolish then, and it's just as foolish now. And because of the victories that I think Satan has had in our culture, we kind of turn it in. So I'd rather have a strategy where I can predict and note than the risk of looking foolish. Because if I go into that couple that has lost their son and they say, so Jason, what do you think? And I have no answer. Well, now I look foolish. And I will fear foolishness, and then I will just gravitate to control. And we have to be open to being perceived as foolish, let me drill down with that, to not having the answers, to look stupid, to look like I have nothing to offer here. Because that's where God comes through. Every big miracle, especially in the Old Testament, Moses looked so foolish for taking his people out to a place they couldn't escape from. Joshua seems so foolish telling the people, let's go to march around. David seems so foolish charging out there. Esther seems so foolish approaching the king Xerxes. All of those, now see, we see it through this lens of the outcome. We're like, oh, that was smart. But up to the point God intervened at their most helpless, foolish-looking moment, it looked foolish. And we have been taught by churches, don't look foolish. Don't look stupid. Have the answers. Be prepared. And we raise up preachers like, I have converted 1 billion people, and I always have the right answer to everything. And I'm like, that's why when we move in a situation where I'm just going to trust God, the devil hits us with, you're going to look foolish. And for many of us, it just shuts us down.
That's good. And that gets to the why do we have these conversations? It's not so that we can memorize a lot of Bible, so that when somebody brings up John 5, 16 through 23, we'll seem really knowledgeable and we'll have all the right answers. we try to have this conversation from that place of humility and that place of being open, right? Of we've read these passages 1,000 times and we're discovering these new things about them. We're discovering another word from God that we didn't see before. And ultimately for us, if we've read this passage 30, 40 times and we see something new in it, the world is going to credit that as foolishness. If you've read something 100 times and you're still like getting a new point from it, like then you weren't reading it right the first time. Then you were dumb the first time. You weren't observant. You weren't mature. And for us, it's such a given that like this is a beautiful part of God. But maybe if you phrase it to the world that like, you could read this same, passage for 30 years and still not understand it completely, the world's going to see that as stupid and foolishness. But for us, that's beauty. That's amazing.
That's right. And that's us believing that his word is living and active.
Yeah.
Which his word isn't living and active because it was well written. His word is living and active because his spirit is working in us to keep understanding to deeper levels what he is saying, not just what he wrote, but what the full meaning of that is. And what if a congregation reads it and people have different conclusions? Well, the truth is they've always had different conclusions.
Yeah.
We just didn't feel safe to share it. But secondly, are we, as leaders, encouraging people, and by leaders, I don't mean leaders of churches, I just mean wherever your influence falls, encouraging people, okay, let's keep talking about this. Let's keep trusting God together. What will God give us as a community that I didn't have alone? See, this conversation with you, Connor, the reason why I keep doing this is because, man, it brings life, because you will say things that I'm like, I have never thought about that. And I've had years of education you haven't had and years of experience you haven't had, and yet God teaches me through you every time. That's the nature of kingdom living. But we've kind of, that's kind of scary because you may say something I disagree with, instead of saying, okay, God, I'm open. You'll make truth come to the surface if we're seeking you. Will we trust you with this?
Wrapping up here, we talked about, coming across as foolish for Jesus, coming across as foolish for the cause of Christ, and the fact that if we're living in concert with the will of God, that's just a reality. We're going to be, not only are we going to appear foolish, sometimes we will even be foolish in certain circumstances. One of the things that draws my mind early in our conversation as an opportunity to be foolish is when you become the older brother or the older teenager in a situation and invite somebody who is not on the same level as you or not in the same group as you into your group, into your party, inviting them into something and calling them to play an active role in that thing in the same way that Jesus does for us. But we, Jason and I both have many different examples of times when somebody called us into something and it meant so much to us that somebody validated our worth and validated our being, and that our presence was a net benefit to the new group or whatever it may be. In fact, for me, one of the reasons that I originally got into youth ministry was I felt like there were some turns in my early teenage years that if that had happened more, if there had been somebody to come alongside of me, it would have just been, I would have avoided a lot of heartache. There would have been a lot of struggle that I didn't have to go through if somebody had been there to initiate me, to call me out, to make me a part of the group. And so our closing kind of question is how do we practice that, right? Because sadly for me, and I think the same thing is for you, I'm not playing as much dodgeball as I used to, so I don't get to actively,
Right.
Although I would love to. If any listeners have an active dodgeball league, let me know. I'll come and I'll play once and I'll be knocked out for a couple of weeks, but I'll be back. So yeah, how do we recognize circumstances where we can invite somebody into playing this active part in our life, our church, our mission, whatever it may be? And then how do we also play the role of the gracious little brother, gracious little kid in terms of God and maybe in terms of people that have leadership over us? Because sometimes for me, somebody might invite me into something, or God might invite me into something that I see as beneath me, but in reality is what he wants for me.
So the way my mind thinks about it is, why don't we see ourselves in that role? Why
Sure.
don't I, using my terminology, why don't I see that I'm Georgie Sams to the other people? And I think that, number one, there is a principle, I believe Paul writes this to Timothy, that Timothy is to entrust trustworthy people who will then pass it to trustworthy people, and you get this sense. So you are a trustworthy person to somebody. Okay. And if you have your eyes open, God will lead people into your life that will trust you. You do not have to have a position to be a leader in God's church. Your group may be small or it may be large, but God says he will give us people to invest in, because he wouldn't have said go and be a disciple with people unless he was going to provide people that could be in that relationship with you. So you have to believe him, because when I talk to people about this, they'll say, I don't have anybody. And so it's almost like you got to lead them through. Okay, first of all, can you pray about it? Just pray about it, that God would open your eyes. But part of it is believing that you are that to somebody else. See, Georgie Sands probably had no idea that this was lighting our day up, or he might have done it more. You know what I mean? It was just, he thought, well, I'll do this for a little bit and I'll move on. And the guys that invited you to play dodgeball probably weren't thinking, man, this will be a guiding principle that you just benefited their team, But to believe, see, we often believe I have nothing to offer, so I'm never in that role. But if you will invite people into your life, number one, and asking God, hey, God, will you show me? And you might invite 20 people into their life, and it's the 20th person it clicks with.
Yeah.
Don't minimize the 19, but just keep watching. But then second of all, the way you invite them in is you legitimize them. So in most of our interactions, it's listening to them. Maybe you're serving and you're like, hey, would you want to come do this with me? Don't underestimate the value of the invitation. If they say no, it's fine. But you're always aware that God will use you in the lives of others. And then oftentimes we're more comfortable with younger, but they could be older or the same age as you. Just to say, hey, God, I believe you use me. That's number one. And number two, so I'm watching and listening. And allowing that to work out, and not being afraid of failure, because success is being open to trusting God when you're interacting with them, and then trusting God when they leave. So even if it ends with them like, you're a dumb idiot, and walk away, you're like, I was being faithful. God, if there's something I was doing wrong, will you teach me, search me, and show me, as David says in Psalm 139, and just being open.
For me, when I was invited to play dodgeball with the older teenagers, I remember after that big match, we were at church camp, and I was hanging out with my older brother's friends in a gazebo. It's late July. There's a bunch of bees around. We all just had canteen. If you have a church camp background, you'll get that reference. And I'm a sweaty 11-year-old boy with a bowl cut and really chubby cheeks. And an older teenager, I think he might have been 17 or 18. He was older. Jeff Johns, he came, and he, in front of my brother's friends who I all admired and looked up to, he reenacted a catch I had made during that dodgeball thing. I dove to the ground and caught the ball. And I remember Jeff Johns got on the floor of the gazebo to imitate, to show everybody what I had done and how cool it was. And I vividly remember that. In fact, oh, my brother doesn't listen to this. My brother was a jerk. He threw some ice at Jeff while he was on the gazebo, and everybody laughed. But and he looked kind of foolish because he got on the ground to imitate this thing. And I remember seeing everybody's reaction to him praising me, and it being like, well, whatever, it's silly. But for me, it was the biggest deal. I have a vivid memory from 14 years ago of when that happened. And I think this is such an important thing for us, that when we talk to people about Jesus, it's not so that they get saved from hellfire. It's not so that they get saved from hell. It's that they get invited into this amazing game of dodgeball, this life. They get invited into this presence of Jesus. And so when there's something I loved about him, for Jeff, it didn't matter to him what they thought. Ultimately, it was a loving and affirming. Ultimately, it was a benefit to me, and it's something that I'm sure nobody else remembers, but I treasure that memory for the rest of my life. So for you, taking a step out into foolishness, taking a step out into uncomfortability or awkwardness, you might end up on the floor with somebody throwing ice or slushy at you, and everybody around you might look at you as a fool. But for that one person, that could mean ultimate life and could be the catalyst for them going forward. We thank you for listening to the Amazed and Perplexed podcast. Grace, peace, and love.